Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jennifer Blemmer, and I am the Director of Women Legislators Lobby. Again, Sam already introduced herself, but she is the Program Manager. Thank you so much for joining us today. If this is your first time with us, welcome. If this is not, welcome back. A brief overview of Women's Action for New Directions. WAND is an organization that builds women's political power with a focus on advocating for peace and security through justice. WILL, which is a program of WAND, is a national nonpartisan network of women legislators that work together to influence the federal budget and budget priorities. One of our main goals in WILL is building up the skills of women legislators as you continue to fight in your legislatures for equality and representation. And so this is why we've brought this webinar together today. A few housekeeping things. Samantha will be handling questions. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A or the chat or raise your hand. Recordings of this webinar and all of the other webinars we've been doing all year will be available on our membership portal for dues paying members. So please make sure to pay your dues. I wanted to take a moment to introduce our three speakers that are going to be bringing us some really fascinating information and some helpful tips on fighting online harassment. First, we'll have Lucina DeMeo, who is a women's rights and gender equality expert, advocate, and author. Her latest research, She Persisted: Women, Politics, and Power in the New Media World, analyzes the relationship between women political leaders and social media. Christina Wolfor, who is the Senior Director of Disinformation Strategies at Strategic Victory Fund, where she helps progressive campaigns in the 2020 election. And then finally, we have Thenmozhi Soundarajan, who is the Executive Director of Equality Labs, an art and tech startup supporting South Asian religious, cultural, and genderqueer communities in the US and South Asia. So thank you and welcome to our speakers, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. So I will get us started with a little bit of an overview that will look at the US and also internationally. And from my side, really, what I would like to for you to take away from this presentation is that there is such a thing as gendered disinformation, meaning truly disinformation that is being spread on the internet, images that are being spread on the internet and that are specifically targeting women political leaders, women journalists, and they really follow storylines that really draw on misogyny and use misogyny in some ways as a political tool, and use gender stereotypes to alter public's understanding of women as leaders, to change their track record for immediate political gain. And so I will walk you through some of the evidence that we have with really the aim at giving you a picture of why women are being attacked and how they are being attacked, not because of the one specific political view, but because of their gender identity. So I'll be sharing my screen now, and then my colleagues will go a little bit more further into what you can do about it. So to begin with, social media has really clearly changed the way women do politics all over the world. 85% of women politicians report using social media. That was a study of a couple of years ago. Probably today is even higher. And almost 1 in 2 parliamentarians surveyed all over the world have seen images that are humiliating or sexually charged of themselves on social media. A female politician or journalist is being harassed on Twitter every 30 seconds in the UK and the US. And this has very negative consequences, not only for the women that are being harassed, but overall for young women, as it truly does represent a very big disincentive for younger women to consider a political career. And there have been a number of studies that have shown how young women are now reporting fear related to social media, or like concern regarding to how their social media persona will be used as one of the big disincentives for considering a political career. In the United States, social media has even a larger role than in other countries for, being used as a main source of information. So 44% of Americans reported using social media as a source of information in the 2016 presidential campaign. That number is growing. And actually 35% of young Americans reported that this was their main source of information. This is an important framework really to show the relevance and the importance of what's going on social media to shape the mindset of voters. I will not share with you the number of images that are horrifying and going on around various social media platforms. You can find them everywhere. You probably have seen some of them yourselves, and they're really horrifying. What we have found out, studying a little bit deeper, is that really there are some very strong patterns that we have been able to see. According to a recent study from the Institute of Strategic Dialogues that looks at the 2020 congressional races, female candidates in those races are more likely to be abused on Twitter than male candidates, with abusive tweets represented more than 50% of overall tweets that they receive, while for male candidates is only 5 or 10, up to 10% at most. And for women of ethnic minority backgrounds, things are much worse, and they are even receiving much more attacks. Both on Twitter and Facebook, the abuse targeting women are more likely to be related to their gender than the ones that are linked to men. So the abuse is really not so much for their policies or for their thoughts or for what, their political record, but really more around them being a woman, with being attacked with misogynist language. And on Facebook, female Democrats received 10 times more abusive comments than their male counterparts, while Republican women received twice as many abusive comments as Republican peers. So there you see that regardless of political parties, really being a woman in the internet and being a woman in politics in the internet is in and of itself seems to be a reason for receiving further attacks. I also want to share with you some studies from the very early months of the US Democratic primaries that look at how the female and the male candidates to the US Democratic primaries were basically attacked on Twitter and the main narratives going on around them. And so what we found is that from the very early months, female candidates tended to be receiving more negative attacks. And those attacks were coming from sources that were lower in credibility, therefore more likely to be inauthentic actors. They were bots, and higher in bias, meaning those were sources that were really more linked to the alt-right. And so there again, you see that these, that overall female candidates are faring worse than male candidates when it comes to those concerns, and really the pervasiveness of attacks coming from sources low in credibility talks to you about really a concerted effort. Those are not just kind of like individual misogynists, but really there is a concerted effort coming from right-wing actors. And the storylines that, according to which those candidates were attacked, were sexist in nature. They really referred to their persona much more than happened on average for male candidates. And they really also tended to be very sticky. So regardless of storylines, regarding of what had happened in the news, those stories kept coming and coming and coming for the women politicians, regardless of what had happened or what had been discovered that day. So those storylines were really sticky. And I will leave it to now my colleague Christina to tell you more about the more recent research that she has done specifically when it comes to the US elections. And of course, I'm happy to share with you all my research, and it's all public and available.
Thanks. So happy to be doing this session with you. I truly believe that states are the laboratories of democracy, and very much appreciate the work of state legislators individually and the legislative bodies to do things like administer the election. So all of these things are just a fundamental part of your everyday work, and happy to be talking to you about some of the developments. So let me pull up some additional background in the way of context and what we are seeing in this space. Give me one second. So the US election, I have been looking at from the work I do with the Disinformation Defense Project out of the Strategic Victory Fund, which really involves many different organizations, including Equality Labs, many different investigators and organizations in the civil rights space, those who are pushing back against the platforms. And through these various channels of information, what we've been able to see is that there really has been a deep program of disinformation and harassment actively at work to undermine the potential of women and to really deplatform them from democracy. So it's not just Senator Harris, but certainly she's a big focus. It's also attacks on women in office at different levels. We should absolutely look at the threat against Governor Whitmer as also connected to disinformation. We were watching the way that these reopened so-called protesters have been organizing and mobilizing on networks in extremist spaces, as well as on Facebook. In fact, a majority of those reopened groups were formed on Facebook itself. And so we saw the way that the reaction to Democratic governors especially was being organized online through disinformation was and is continuing to create a great deal of risk and harm that has many gendered components to it. Lucina mentioned a little bit, and I think certainly Equality Labs work has spoken to this, is that there is the intersectionality of this too. So where issues of race and religion are attributed and are an additional attack line, makes it particularly problematic, makes certain profiles of women more apt to be a part of that attack line. And then the squad, is leveraged against other candidates and against other women leaders as further evidence to try to implicate them for nefarious activities or extremism on the other side. This is a few slides from our partner GQR, who does tremendous work in this area. If you do want to have a better monitoring and response system that you set up for your state, post-election, looking at some of these issues, I would recommend GQR. So they're always good to remind us that we spend a lot of time talking about Twitter, but in fact, the majority of the platforms where people get their news and interact is on Facebook and YouTube. There are also networks that are particularly well organized, homegrown, to take this coordinated activity across different platforms and make their information go viral. And why that is so important is because the algorithms, which are always the secret sauce of how the platforms work, are being manipulated by these types of entities where there are already existing rules of engagement that in fact the platforms are not complying with, and it allows them to get more traction and pick up. And then we also have to consider that the content matters too. So it was an MIT study a couple years ago that showed that disinformation travels 6 times faster than the truth on Twitter. And it's because of the extremist nature and the way that the algorithms are in fact built, and these platforms are built for extremism. So when we look at the top performing Facebook pages by pages, there's only one entity that would be considered on the left. The rest are highly organized channels to carry disinformation by conservative, right-wing, anti-women, misogynistic networks for the most part. Like the Daily Wire, there was an expose in Popular Information that explicitly went through the way that this coordinated so-called news works across platforms, yet they do not do anything about it. And they have a highly focused effort against AOC through this Patriot Network, which involves many different types of properties. So we see the same kind of attack, whether it's AOC or Nancy Pelosi, or state legislative leaders or governors, then being put in different properties where it looks like it's in fact different, but it's a coordinated campaign. So what can we do? I want to outline a framework for thinking, and then we'll go more to direct responses in terms of digital security. But I want to paint a picture more on the policy level and sort of stepping back and looking at this as a whole. So holding social media companies accountable, I believe, is maybe one of our most fundamental objectives in the world right now. You know, I come at this having spent the last 10 years living outside of the US and working with women running for office in parliaments in various countries, as well as helping ensure fair and credible elections. And I can, you know, account for the fact that the social media dynamics that are going on in the world and in the US are so incredibly dangerous. They hold the levers, they hold the powers, and they are affecting the way that we have discourse all around the world. And I want to sort of point to, it's not related to gender, but it's an important study. One of our partners, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which tracks online extremism, did this excellent report that showed, in light of COVID, what in fact were the platforms doing. For an issue that is literally life and death, how they dealt with misinformation was essential to point out. What it also showed us, though, is when they have the political will to make changes, they can in fact make these changes. So all of the things that they don't want to do, either around election misinformation or misinformation, or around other forms of extremism, that is a choice, right? There are things that are part of the way they organize their work, that when they want to make those choices, they can in fact, you know, tap down, you know, the levers in some way. Organizations like the Color of Change, NAACP, ADL, and many others came together to really press on this point, to do a public campaign to say, there's a connection with your revenue, and the reason why these companies aren't doing this is because it would cost them money. So hate is very profitable, and their systems are really wired to set this up. So they did this effort to focus on the root causes around revenue, and to be able to, you know, make recommendations that were completely reasonable that they could in fact implement, and to then encourage advertisers to boycott Facebook, which they did for the month of July at a cost of over $600 million, because of the way that advertisers inadvertently, not to their own knowledge, end up subsidizing this kind of hateful content. So these efforts to expose and for communities to come together and say, we're asking and demanding changes, and here's how you're responsible, is an essential part of the accountability trail. and one that the public backs. So when we've done additional research to say, well, what does the public think about any of these things? The Stop Hate for Profit campaign in particular, very popular. And in fact, it was a boost to the companies that decided to participate. So that's the kind of power and reorganizing the way that we have these conversations and how we bring different stakeholders to bear can be shaped. I also want to point out, even on an issue like Holocaust denial, so the Holocaust has been an issue that has, Facebook said, we're not going to allow, well, let's put it this way. They did allow Holocaust denial for years, up until just about 2 weeks ago. So you had, in fact, Holocaust survivors record videos saying, why, Mark Zuckerberg, are you denying our existence? This is how dangerous it is. There was an open letter signed by over 600 rabbis asking them to change it. There was multiple campaigns over multiple years, and they did nothing until the last 2 weeks because of, some of the regulation threats and because some of the ways in which coming towards this election, they will in fact be blamed. But when we go back to public opinion, the public is on our side. The majorities of women and even teenage girls, all of the categories of harm that we're looking at, there's an awareness that these individuals who make up the fabric of our society are in fact more likely to be attacked, and they are holding platforms accountable, and they're willing to do that. And that, I think, is an important message for you as state legislators. We have sort of let Congress deal with this. Like, well, okay, there's another congressional hearing. There's another activity where Zuckerberg is on. But you, as a state legislative body, could absolutely start to put forward measures, even if they are about defining the problem, or a task force that is looking at the implications of social media in your state. A variety of things can be done to further define the problem. A well-defined problem is half of the solution, and we should not just think that there's some other referee, either at the federal level or in some other country, that's going to come and resolve this. We all need to do what we can to press on resolutions. And we can share some of this research later. I also want to just end on a couple other things. We do have action within the Democratic Women's Caucus, where you have Representative Spear developed a letter explicitly talking about the ways that gender disinformation is manifesting itself. They took this to Facebook. They're in a conversation with Facebook, but you could do the same thing. You could take the elements of this letter, you could press this in front of Facebook, and I should remind everyone that as an executive, Sheryl Sandberg has branded herself as someone who is gender sensitive, who is about having the backs of women, and in fact has made millions of additional dollars on those principles. We have to hold the people who are in fact positioning themselves as being relevant to women's leadership, accountable for the things that are happening on their own platforms. So this was the first time this letter was explicitly put in front of Facebook, and it was signed by lawmakers from over 30 countries because of the global nature of this problem. So I think that there's many things, post-election, it's a very hard time, to start any new initiatives now, but post-election to really shape this conversation in a different way in your state. What I also want to say is, in the meantime, we have to, do what we can to talk about these threats in a way that doesn't further amplify them. And so it's very sort of tricky. And part of this work has been done by a coalition of women's rights organizations: Ultraviolet, Planned Parenthood, NARAL, She the People, Higher Heights, Color of Change, and many others came together 2 weeks ago to put this guide together, how media could report on disinformation in a responsible way. and that it really is trying to hold media to account, and to do so in a way where we aren't further amplifying those attack lines. Organizations like GQR and others who advise on how we do this kind of work more effectively have had great advice about our own responsibility in terms of media literacy. But I put this to the end because, you know, the media literacy is really not the overall solution out of this. In fact, it takes the burden off of the platforms. It's very hard for the naked eye to determine what is mis or disinformation. But when we do see it, when we see egregious material, when we see something that we're pretty sure is a result of this campaign, we shouldn't retweet it. We shouldn't amplify it. We have to be a little bit more clever in the way that we call it out. That's one of the most important walkaways in the way that we bring gender disinformation into our political dialogue, to do so in a way that doesn't make these issues, you know, debatable. So when we've looked at how Senator Harris has been attacked, we've been encouraging people not to argue back on those attack lines, but instead to push out proactive messages that reinforce the kind of story that we want to tell about her. So I'm going to pause there and hand it over to the Maury, who will continue to guide us through some of the do's and don'ts and how you can take some of these into your own hands.
Okay, wonderful. Such a pleasure to meet everybody here. And I'm really glad that we're able to talk about this collectively, because I think that too often by the time candidates and elected folks are actually in the middle of a disinfo campaign, there's already steps that you're having to do to mitigate it that are harmful and are painful to deal with. And so our hope with this conversation is that by being able to take a step back and understanding that it's not just about you and it's not just about that message, but that it's a larger campaign to deplatform women from democracy, we really understand that we have to take a structural approach to the structural problem. And I just really loved all of the presentations today, so it's really great to be able to speak to that. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is thinking about digital self-defense for legislators. And, you know, as our previous speaker spoke about, you know, I think part of being able to start thinking about the practicalities of this is to actually get your mindset focused on the fact that there's not a before. We're not going to go to a before 2020 or even a before 2016 where, you know, supposedly there were nicer elections. This is the reality that we're in, and that volatility is going to be the new norm for a very long time. So we actually have to change the way that we campaign and change the way that we support women to campaign, because if we want reflective democracies, we have to understand that tactically, most women candidates and campaigns are underfunded when it comes to defensive measures like this. And that these are vigilantes. Like, I think a lot of times when we've supported campaigns, women that are traumatized and they're in the middle of it, they can't process the fact that these people are able to do this, sometimes within the parameters of the law, but sometimes without it. But that the acknowledgement of this violence is not just personal, it's actually deeply political, and it's part of a larger political project. And then I also think a really critical third piece to this, especially as you're thinking about strategies for resilience, is that attacks on you can often extend to also the organizations that are in your base. And Ilhan Omar is a great example of this. And Representative Omar, during the time both of her campaign and while she was in her office, many of the Black Muslim and Muslim feminist groups in her district were consistently under attack by the same actors that were also attacking her as an individual. And, you know, this includes like places of worship, as well as grassroots organizations and advocacy institutions, and they also were unprepared. So I sometimes think, depending on the kind of campaign that you're running, you want to think about cyber resilience, not just for you, but for all of your supporters, and to think about ways that there could be kind of like a public inoculation about some of the challenges that people are facing. And a way to look at it is that, if you look at the summary of what Christina gave you, there is this intersection where we're understanding that disinformation is designed inherently to deplatform. But almost every disinformation campaign that we've seen has always been partnered with some form of cyber attack. That can be an attack on the campaign infrastructure, attack on like campaign finances, or directly going after the emails or other private communications of candidates. And, we just have to look at like what happened with John Podesta in 2016 to remind ourselves how potent those cyber attacks can be, and that often they can be iterative. Like a disinformation attack could lead to vulnerabilities that open up a cyber attack, and then the information from that cyber attack can then be used around disinformation. So you need to really have both plans in place to really be able to maintain power. And I think this is also another critical shift. And I think Lucina's work is just a good reminder of this, is that, I think that, most of us, like, I think, are thinking that disinformation and cyber attacks are only going to happen on the campaign angle. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that candidates and once becoming elected officials face it throughout the entirety of their public career. And with some candidates, they even face it long after they've run for office because of how polarizing race might have been. So I think that one of the things that we really recommend, even as you're beginning to like mark your campaign or thinking about your process in office, is to, one, have a plan. And most folks don't have a plan. And having done rapid response around this for the last couple of years, we usually get called in the middle of a crisis. And it's very clear that there was no budget. There was no clear line of command. And there was also a sense of trauma that really limited the ways people could think expansively to structurally support themselves. And so I think being able to change the mindset of your engagement so that these attacks are not going to stop. This is actually part of the cost of being in democracy at this point. And it's the structural barrier that women and women of color in particular face in order to be able to represent their communities appropriately. And so I think that, in addition to, the groups that are supporting more reflective democracy work, there needs to be an increased investment to support the cybersecurity and resiliency of women that are running for office and keeping for office. But also, you want to prepare your families and loved ones for that support. Because many, many times when we've supported people in the middle of this, I think people have been so focused on the issues. What's happened to the partners and the children is just really overwhelming. And I'm thinking of a candidate that basically, was targeted by white nationalists in her race, and they ended up finding her children's Instagrams, sending racist and very vile content to her children and the friends of her children. They also hacked her husband's business and also her husband's partner's business as well. I mean, it was insane to kind of see the extent to which the collateral damage spreads. And that's why having the plan, having the budget, and having a clear line of command, and preparing the people that you love for what kind of endeavor this is, really can make a difference for when and if something bad were to happen, everybody's in formation. And that's a really critical thing to think about, is that we cannot promise you with cybersecurity that an attack isn't going to happen. Like, digital security isn't a silver bullet. What digital security is like a go bag and a plan of action for when the shit falls, like you're able to protect yourself. And it's hard because I think that, I think that one of the things that I find is that many of the times that people are starting to deal with these cybersecurity problems, they have a vendor that's former military or law enforcement. And most of the folks that come from that cybersecurity background are not feminist and are actually very traumatizing to deal with when you're in the middle of an attack, particularly if the attack features sensitive information, like stuff from a previous partner, or like we saw saw in the last couple of years where a legislator had, like, you know, a domestic violence partner share, you know, confidential information. Those are all things that, you know, while, you know, you want a technologist who's competent to deal with it, you also want someone who actually understands what a violation and violent experience this is. And you really will only get that through a feminist vendor. And there are multiple feminist vendors that you can find now because of the advocacy and the need to provide self-defense. But you really want to do this research before you go into the thick of campaigning and while you're in office, because we can definitely say, based on what we've seen in this last cycle, that no matter who wins in the office in this cycle of elections, every single woman that gets a seat is going to have to fight to keep her seat, and they're going to do whatever they can to deplatform you. So being able to search for that go-to, you know, team that's part of your deck is going to be really critical. The other thing is that I really recommend that you and your family's personal data is scrubbed using services like Privacy Duck. And, you know, of course, there are limits that what can be removed because of the public records related to candidates and people who run for office. But Privacy Duck, you know, essentially takes your name off of many databases that sell and broker your information for money. And these sites are often the low-hanging fruit that many garden variety trolls will use to be able to do more nefarious attacks, like something like swatting, where they call the police and say a serious crime has happened at your house, or, you know, send you, you know, threats, physical, or, you know, send you like mail threats, or harass you on your phone. And it's a very simple service. It takes 2 weeks to implement, but if you can do this before you have more public-facing duties, it's a godsend, particularly for people in your family that aren't public-facing and, you know, relish their discretion. The other thing is that we really recommend that you do an anti-doxing protocol for you and your family and anyone that's public-facing on the campaign. And, you know, I'll make sure that the copy of these slides are available after this presentation. But what the anti-doxing protocol is that, you know, doxing, again, is a very violent tactic of these vigilantes where they weaponize your personal data. This can be addresses, this could be phone numbers, this could be your social security number. And with that information, they can do lots of harm. They could, you know, try to commandeer your cell phone. They could try to seize your social media accounts. They might even be able to do charges back and forth and try to take out money of your accounts. And in this election cycle, we have seen many folks reach out to us who have been candidates, as well as organizations that are doing voter mobilization whose leaders have been doxxed, as well as their organizations breached because there wasn't basic cyber protections. So, you know, this protocol, and there's a full checklist at the link on the slide deck, you know, at the minimum, you want to make sure that your team is using VPNs, which kind of help protect your access to the internet. Something called two-factor authentication, which basically adds another layer of authentication for when you log into your email or bank accounts, as well as a password manager. And, you know, I'm going to be real honest, like most of the anti-doxing protocol is very administrative and banal. You know, you don't need to be a cybersecurity master's to be able to know how to do it. But what you need to do is have time and the prioritization of your safety to be able to do that. And, you know, I would say if you were to do the whole anti-doxing protocol just for yourself, it's probably 4 to 5 hours. And, you know, very few people have 4 to 5 hours to just knock out a project like this, especially so in such intense times. But I guarantee you, you would much rather put in this 4 to 5 hours ahead of time than deal with 30 to 40 hours of pain on the other end of a crisis because, you know, you didn't have the right password or defense mechanism for your team. And, you know, and I think that the thing that I really want to leave people with is that, you know, these challenges, I think, are part of the cost of doing democracy. But I think it's also a remarkable thing to see the feminist response that's rising as a result of this. And no one is intimidated. No one is saying that we don't want to participate and take power. In fact, people are leaning more into, claiming the ring for our communities. And I think thinking very strategically and also asking for the resources you need for your safety and self-defense is really critical. And I say this having talked with funders who are supporting different, projects to support more women running. Very few of them actually thought about cybersecurity as a necessity to be able to have diverse candidates. And I said, if you don't do that, it is cruel and unusual because you're putting people into a bull ring with people who have state level tools to basically deplatform your candidates before they get started. And so I think that we actually also have to think of a sea change about what it means to be a woman in power, and that we have to go in with the proper kind of armament, the proper resources to fight, and the courage and the mindset that allows us to be able to be more nimble around this volatile environment. And luckily, we have lots of tools and lots of workflows that can help you get there, but you need to make that as a priority in your campaign planning, and make sure that you have a chain of command that can implement this, not just from a defensive place, but from a proactive place with vision. So I will pass it back to the facilitator, and looking forward for the rest of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing that information. It's incredibly important. I know this is something that we've talked a lot about with our legislators, how to make sure that they are staying safe online, and essentially fighting back against what is inevitable, which is women taking over the world. We have 2 questions so far. Sorry, 3 questions in our Q&A, and I will just read them and we can see who can best answer. As a legislator, I'm not allowed to block people on social media. I flagged the commenter as engaging in hate speech for calling me a baby murderer. Is that the only thing that I can do? And I'm assuming maybe Themori, you may want to answer this, or Christina, you may want to answer this.
Maury, any thoughts when blocked?
Yes.
Blocking is an option.
So I think that what's actually very important is that as a legislator, you also have a direct channel into the platforms, because they're supposed to have representatives for officials. And if content violates certain hate speech, it is important to kind of raise it and create a record that it was raised, and their inaction can also become a point of advocacy down the line. So I think the first thing is to either, if you don't know who that Facebook representative is that you need to talk to on the elected side, certainly someone on this team can definitely help with that. And then I think the other thing is that since you're not allowed to block people, the other thing that I do is you can actually have like a set of folks that are like your, that are part of your membership or your base, who can kind of like lift up more positive comments, and then try to just kind of use the rankings systems of the platforms or the posts to just kind of brigade that content down. And it's incredibly frustrating, and it's terrible to have to deal with. But I think that those are 2 strategies that I've seen that have been really effective.
Yeah, and I would just echo the need to document. I mean, the exercise of reporting to Facebook should not give anyone the delusion, that they will actually act quickly. But it is part of that accountability trail. The Kenosha militia page in Wisconsin was flagged 455 times, and it was ultimately not taken down by Facebook. It was the actual organizer of that event. But having that record out in the public was part of the evidence trail and the pressure that is meant to show in detail what's going on. I would also say perhaps there needs to be a task force or a working group or somewhat that looks at what are the social media implications for state legislators who are women, that be seeded as part of a recognition with your cyber teams or with others who are coming up with the rules, so that there's some, a knowledge and education about the gendered aspects of these attacks and why, when aimed at women, they tend to be, more threatening.
Thank you. Our second question, on a broader level, one thing I've become increasingly concerned about is fake accounts on Facebook spreading misinformation, particularly the fact that they are micro-targeting neighborhood groups and other smaller groups. This has happened in my own neighborhood group, with fake accounts spreading harmful misinformation about the Oregon wildfires and protests, causing very real-world consequences. Not entirely sure what the policy solutions to these would be, aside from maybe account verification. But as a state legislator, it feels like federal action would be the most effective. Is there anything from a policy level that we could or should be doing at the state level?
Yes. So this is, the crux of the problem here is that there is not an ability, other than through shame right now, to do much to get Facebook to do anything about that. Just as an example, I was involved in European Parliament election, where one of the investigators who was tracking what Facebook and the platforms may do during that critical election identified 200,000 suspicious Facebook pages operating to the benefit of the very, very far right party in Germany. So they only had, in that case, 11% of the actual public support, and they had over 82% of all social media share in the lead up to that election. And Facebook even had 1,000 content moderators based in Berlin specifically, and they didn't identify or shut down these pages, and they were spewing anti-Muslim rhetoric and, a major influence operation. So there's not, frankly, a lot that we can do to get them to shut these things down, other than to create incentives and create a sense of threat. And that's why I really wanted to spend the time highlighting the public opinion part of this, because that is one of the exposure opportunities, is to show that they are on the wrong side of public opinion. They are on the wrong side of history. Federal movement, let's see the nature of the makeup of Congress. Right now, you have members of Congress who more likely to blame the platforms for conservative bias, which independent studies have shown no such bias exists. And in fact, I would argue the reverse in the way that their policies are organized. They really, do more to the benefit of extremism and right-wing networks and how they coordinate. So I would say we have to, think post-election together about some of the legislative efforts that could be instituted in the states, especially around fraud. Because when there's lack of exposure to about their monthly active users, they're never really wanting to be very public about that. That is what they base their revenue on as companies. Having a set of state legislative bills that is asking for more transparency about their basic business practices could also be a way to expose, and create a threat. Because the number one objective is you have to have some levers that you can operate with that are able to show that there's, accountability that will be waged at one point or the other.
Yeah, and I want to say that you will find that your female constituents will be natural allies. Christina has shared very powerful opinion polls regarding the role that social media has. In general, women are even more suspicious of social media accounts, even more concerned regarding privacy. There was a latest report from the Web Foundation that interviewed women all over the world and found that in fact they trust social media very little, that they want for more to happen, and therefore I think, you know, it's important to look at these issues and take advantage of those allies that will be naturally there.
Thank you. And then we have one more question. What do you do when your sites are pirated?
For the person that asked that question, when you mean pirated, do you mean that they made a duplicate version of your site and then that site is filled with disinformation, or do you mean that they've commandeered your site?
Are you able to answer both versions of the question?
Sure. Okay. So in all of those situations, my recommendation is work with a professional, because oftentimes if those situations has happened, there might be a deeper a deeper infiltration into your systems. And so you want someone to do a full forensic scans of your email and comms, as well as like your devices, you know, depending on how big the breach has gone. But that said, like in the case of your site being commandeered, it's fairly easy in terms of the conversations you can have with your provider to be able to get it back. It might not be instantaneous. It might take like, you know, 28 to 48 hours. But, you know, that is, you know, many people anticipate these kinds of attacks at this point, and things like two-factor authentication actually prevent people from being able to commandeer your site. So that's one of the reasons why we recommend like all of your different platforms having 2FA. But it can be recovered. We've helped people recover their sites, and that's not difficult. However, in the instance where someone has created a fake site or a copy site, that can be a little bit challenging because certain things are not copyrightable. And in the balance around fair speech, our free speech, you cannot take certain sites down, even if they're parody sites. And so you might be able to do some legal action. You might also call upon the company that hosts the sites and prey on their, like, you know, their moral values, whether or not they'll host it. But it's just like what Christina was saying, is that sometimes shame will work for that, but sometimes it's not. You know, this is the problem of being in the policy gap that we're in, and really having this like policy set up where we're not talking about a safe internet, we're talking about an internet that makes money on behalf of hate. And so, you know, I think you have to take it as a case-by-case strategy, but like a good cybersecurity vendor would help you entertain all of those options. And as an organization, we've worked with tons of women who have been in this position, and I can say it's a toss-up whether or not you can take it down, which is unfortunate, you know. Which then I think you work on leaning into your comm strategy, leaning into your base, and making sure that you're able to hold your message and not getting taken off, you know, too much by that bad actor.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add a little bit of a, I guess, extra to that question. If you could provide some recommendations on specifically Instagram. I'm sure some of our legislators, I know myself, you know, someone makes a clone of your page, they kind of change the number around, or, you know, it's not you, but it's a clone version of you. There is a way that you can have that taken down through Instagram. And so I wanted to know if you had any additional information to add to that as well for any of the legislators like that might have happened to.
So again, I think this is why it's really important that your campaign, like as part of your cyber resilience, should know who is the representative to escalate to for elected officials and candidates. They have, like, you know, all of these platforms, and Instagram's escalation channel is Facebook because it's the same company. So you just need to know who is the person responsible for supporting elections for your, and sometimes it'll break down by party. So you know, you need to just find that out and get that information. And definitely Christina or I could like get that information for you if you're kind of wading into that waters for the first time. But generally, when you spot a fake account, there's two ways that the platforms look at solving this problem. The first is through verification. So if you're a candidate or as a representative, you don't have a verified account, you want to actually begin that process, because their idea of helping to stop duplicity is that they're like, well, we verified you, so it's very clear that this is the official account, and that's the way that will kind of lift you up over any fakes. But that said, fake accounts are not allowed to be on the platform, particularly because they're violations of the terms of standards, and so you can report them. And so what we've done for different folks who've been in this situation is we'll put together a document with all of those fake handles, submit it to the representative at the platform, and then put pressure on them to take it down. And usually, like when they see like enough compelling evidence with candidates and with elected officials, they work much faster than they do with regular citizens. And so I think that that channel is like the best way that I've seen to address it.
Thank you. And we have a question, recommendations about password managers. What would you suggest would be the best?
Okay, this is a great question. I love everyone who asked that question, so I want to give you a high five for thinking about that. So the password manager I recommend is 1Password. It's really easy to use. It works on both platforms, on both your computer and your phone, and that's really critical because you might be on 10 to 15 different platforms for your work, and anything that I've seen in terms of working with legislators is that 90% of your time is on your phone. And so if you have a password manager that works on your computer, but you're not feeling comfortable with on your mobile device, that's a problem. And so most of the people I've seen, even in crisis situations, when they've started to do the transition into 1Password, it's been great. And the great thing about 1Password is that there's a 1Password for democracy. So if you're connected at all to like voting rights or to democracy work, there's like a discount, if not free option, which is great for emerging candidates. And there's a team administration option that makes it really easy to administer on the background for your IT or cybersecurity person.
Thank you. And then I have one more question here. Is it correct to say that on private pages, you can unfriend people, delete comments, or block them, but not on your public page as legislators?
Christina, do you know that information? I don't know the legal parameters of that, actually.
Because Facebook is one of our national partners, we can actually, for Amy Peruso, we can get you connected to our contact at Facebook who can answer that question for you. So I'll make a note to do that just for that case. And then another question is, do you have any tips on getting verified as a state legislator on Twitter?
Oh, okay. Well, here's the thing. Like, is their verification process a total mess? Absolutely. But that said, again, as an elected official, you should have an easier time of it. And I think that if you need support in making that connection to the policy team, either myself or Christina could make that happen. And with elected officials, I've seen the verification process usually be anywhere from like 1 to 3 days. Particularly once you submit all the paperwork, because they view the verification of elected officials as a critical part of their support to stop disinformation. So you will have an expedited process, but you just need to submit everything with that. And if you need that introduction, we'd be happy to do that, or Christina could do it as well.
Yeah, I would say get all your asks in before the election while they're maybe more interested in listening. So.
Okay. And so because we will be sharing this recording with all dues paying members of WIL, people will have access to it. But for all of you, where can people find your tips and information and research?
So for me, there is a webpage, she-persisted.org, where you can find my research and a couple of links to these other things that have been going on. And you can also reach out to me at lucina@shepersisted.org, and I'm going to write here my email address, and Jennifer, feel free to share it with anyone who's interested.
So our project is an election cycle only project. So it's really through the partners I would point you to, like Equality Labs. I will put in the chat where you can find the fair reporting in an era of disinformation. And I will also give Jennifer some additional resources of those partner organizations that I think are great in terms of do's and don'ts and other practical advice. And I will share my email, and you're welcome to, reach out to me directly too.
Wonderful. And for folks that are looking for cybersecurity support or just strategy, we're happy to help. And you can reach out to us at equalitylabs.org. And my email is securitysupport@equalitylabs.org, and I put that in there. I've also put the link to our anti-doxing protocol, which will give you a sense of the workflow needed to kind of, tighten up your individual digital security. And I think anyone that's like on your team, that's like your IT provider or is helping your campaign think about IT issues, should be able to take that list as a beginning strategy plan for what you need to do to kind of think defensively. But we're here. We've supported many folks that are in your shoes. And I think that we're just going to become smarter, more aligned, and really stand together, because there's no way through this very difficult moment except right through it. And I think thinking about this not as a problem that isn't solvable, it is. There's clear policy, advocacy, and self-defense measures that we can make. And it's women doing it for other women. And that's like the incredible power of this moment, because we want this reflective democracy. So it's really incredible to be here. And we're just looking forward to kind of building strength and being here to hold the line together.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I will also, echo everything everything that Maury said. It's fascinating in the disinformation space. Some of the kind of sexier angles, are around foreign interference and other aspects of this problem. It's only going to be if women come together and say there's in fact a gendered aspect of this. And, as I have heard from many investigators, there's really no topic that doesn't have a gendered aspect to it. If you look at the attacks on climate change and against Greta Thunberg, those also are very much aimed at her being a young woman speaking out. So there's just no shortage of examples. And I'm gonna share with you too, something that you can absolutely do and might wanna model. I also am a professor of gender studies at the George Washington University, and we did a forum earlier in the summer where we had people testify into just their own personal testimonials. These were lawmakers, they were journalists, they were activists. We did a session with the university, we recorded it. I will give you links to that. That could absolutely be done post-election in state legislative bodies across the country, even if there's not formal mechanisms, ways in which we can highlight and lift up not only the problem, but the women who are on the front line of helping solve it. And I think that would be a tremendous, opportunity for you.
Yeah, and for me, I just want to say I've interviewed many women in politics all over the world, and often I hear there is almost a concern to call sexism out of a fear of being considered a whiner, out of a fear of being considered weak. The truth is that when you call sexism out, that isn't really for yourself. It's for everyone. And it really makes an incredible difference for young women looking at the women politicians that aren't afraid to call things as they are, and it really encourages them to be more active. Therefore, I really want for every one of us to think of this not as a personal issue, but as really a gendered issue, and an issue where each one of us can really make a difference, not only for ourselves, but for so many other women and young women.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to Lucina and Christina and Thermori for being on with us today. This was incredibly important, obviously very relevant to the time that we're in. And I'm hopeful that all of our legislators will be able to apply a lot of the tips that you all provided. I definitely want to thank you all for being with us today. I did want to take the time to thank all of our legislators and legislative staff for getting on with on this webinar today. This is actually my last webinar as the WIL director. I will be moving on to the Millennial Action Project, where I will still be working with state legislators because state government is my jam. So I'm super excited, and hopefully I can take some of the stuff that we've even talked about to work with those young legislators as well. Again, so thank you all so much for getting on today. Sam, did you want to give us anything before we ended the webinar?
No, we're good.
Excellent. So again, just want to wrap up and thank you so much for everyone for getting on. We will be doing, well, Wand will be doing some webinars later in after election time when everyone's brain is better off and we've had time to cool off. So please be on the lookout for that. And again, thank you all so much for making this an amazing 2 years building up this program. Super excited to have done it. So that is that for me. Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right.